In today's video, I'm going to teach you how to speak English like a pro. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to teach you a series of phrases that you can use in any situation, whether that's at work, at school, or in your daily life, to help you make a great impression on anybody you meet. The phrases I'm going to teach you today are going to help you level up your vocabulary and sound more polite. Ready? Let's get into the video. I'm going to divide today's lesson into two parts. The first part will be dedicated to phrases that you can use every single day in your daily conversations. The second part will focus on English at work, meetings, presentations, emails, any professional situation where you have to use English. Now, if you're in a conversation with somebody and you don't know something, you might say, I don't know. I don't know. But if you want to sound more polite, you could say, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. I'm not entirely certain, to be honest. I'm not entirely certain, to be honest. That's a good question. I'd have to look into it. I'd have to look into it. I couldn't say for certain. I couldn't say for certain. These are all alternatives for I don't know. Maybe you're in a conversation with somebody and you don't understand something. Instead of saying, I don't understand, you could say, sorry, could you please repeat that? Sorry, could you please repeat that? Or, I'm not quite following. I'm not quite following. Could you please explain that a bit more? Could you please explain that a bit more? I want to make sure I understood everything correctly. Do you mean XYZ? Would you mind elaborating on that? Would you mind elaborating on that? Sometimes in a conversation, you'll have to tell people no. There's nothing wrong with saying no, but sometimes you want to say no more politely. So you could say, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not. That doesn't really work for me. That doesn't really work for me. I'd rather not. I'd rather not. Or, unfortunately, that's not something I'm able to do right now. Unfortunately, that's not something I'm able to do right now. Instead of saying wait, you could say, bear with me for a moment. Bear with me for a moment. Just give me a second. Just give me a second. Could you hold on just for a moment? Could you hold on just for a moment? Or, if you could bear with me briefly, I'll be right with you. If you can bear with me briefly, I'll be right with you. Sometimes you want to tell people that they are wrong. So instead of saying you are wrong, which sounds very direct and sometimes a bit rude, you could say, I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not sure I agree with that. I see it a little differently, actually. I see it a little differently, actually. That's an interesting point, though I'd push back slightly on that. That's an interesting point, though I'd push back slightly on that. With respect, there might be another way to look at this. With respect, there might be another way to look at this. Instead of saying, I need help, you could say, could you give me a hand with this? Could you give me a hand with this? Would you mind helping me out for a moment? Would you mind helping me out for a moment? I wonder if I could trouble you for some help with this. I wonder if I could trouble you for some help with this. I'd really appreciate your input on this if you have a moment. These are some really good ways to ask for help. And lastly, if you disagree with somebody, instead of saying, I disagree, you could say, I'm not totally convinced by that. I'm not totally convinced by that. I take your point, but I do see it differently. I take your point, but I do see it differently. That's a fair argument, but I'd offer a slightly different perspective. That's a fair argument, but I'd offer a slightly different perspective. And lastly, I understand where you're coming from, though I'd have to respectfully disagree. These are all great ways to say I disagree without offending anybody. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to English at the Ready here on YouTube, and if you want to study English with me and my team, you can click the link in the description below to learn more about our programs. Now, let's move on to the second half of this video. As I promised, we're going to talk about professional situations. Work, academic environments, meetings, presentations, emails, and stuff like that. It's really, really important that when you're in these situations, you don't offend anybody, you don't speak rudely, and you don't be too direct. The key to sounding more polite is to be a bit more indirect with your language. So let's say you're in a meeting and you tell somebody to send me the report. That's very direct, but it might come across as a bit rude. Instead, you could say, could you send over the report when you get a chance? Would it be possible to share the report with me today? Would it be possible to? When you have a moment, I'd appreciate if you could forward the report. When you have a moment, I'd appreciate if you could forward the report. At your earliest convenience, could you please share the report with me? At your earliest convenience, could you please share the report with me? These are all great alternatives and they sound super, super polite. Sometimes you make mistakes. So instead of saying, I made a mistake, which is totally honest, you might want to make yourself sound a little bit better. And instead, you could say, I want to flag an error on my end. I want to flag an error on my end. There was an oversight on my part. There was an oversight on my part. I've identified an error that I should have caught earlier. Or there was a misstep on my side. There was a misstep on my side. Now, if something is urgent, you could say, this is urgent. But if you want to sound a bit more polite and diplomatic, you could say, this is time sensitive. This is time sensitive. I want to flag this as a priority. I want to flag this as a priority. I appreciate you're busy, but this does require fairly prompt attention. This does require fairly prompt attention. Or, I'd be grateful if we could treat this as a matter of some urgency. Instead of saying, I don't have time, you could say, my schedule is fairly full right now. Could we find another time? My schedule is fairly full right now. Could we find another time? I'm tied up at the moment. I'm tied up at the moment. I want to give this the attention it deserves. Could we schedule some time later this week? Or, my capacity is limited at present. Now, earlier we talked about disagreement, but if you're disagreeing with your boss or your manager, what could you say? Well, you might say, I'd like to share a slightly different perspective, if that's welcome. I want to make sure I'm understanding the reasoning. Could you please walk me through your thinking? I have a few thoughts on this that I'd like to share if now is a good time. Or, I respect the direction and I'd like to put forward an alternative for consideration, if that's possible. Instead of saying that isn't good enough, if you're not satisfied with something, you could say, this is a solid foundation. I'd like to discuss a few minor tweaks before we move forward. I'd like to discuss a few minor tweaks before we move forward. A tweak is a small change. If you tweak something, you make a small change. There are a few areas we could develop further. There are a few areas we could develop further. And lastly, I'd like to revisit this together. There are some elements I feel could better reflect our standards. There we have it. We've come to the end of today's video. If you use the phrases I taught you in the last few minutes, you will speak English like a pro. If you use these phrases, you will make a good impression on anybody you meet, whether that's at work, at school, or in your daily life. Don't forget to subscribe to English at the Ready here on YouTube if you'd like to improve your English further. Click the link in the description below if you'd like to learn more about how you can study English with me and my team. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and to subscribe to English at the Ready here on YouTube. Let me know in the comments, did you learn any new vocabulary in today's lesson? I'll see you soon.